As awareness of Eric's condition gradually entered public conversation, Simon Cowell found himself in a position he had never experienced before. For most of his career, public attention had been something he could direct, shape, or respond to on his own terms. But this situation was different. It involved a child who had not chosen visibility, and a story that carried deeply personal implications. What began as occasional speculation online slowly grew into broader commentary across media platforms. People who had no understanding of Eric's life began forming narratives based on fragments of observation. Some were sympathetic but uninformed, while others were intrusive in ways that ignored basic boundaries of privacy. For Simon, this created a difficult tension. Speaking out risked exposing his son further, while remaining silent allowed misinformation to grow unchecked. Neither option felt fully right. The decision was not about public image, it was about protection. Eventually, the boundary became clear. Eric's life was not a subject for public interpretation. It was a private experience that required stability, not scrutiny. From that point forward, Simon's communication with the outside world became more deliberate and limited. What remained unseen by the public was the emotional effort behind that silence. It was not avoidance, it was containment. A conscious effort to keep a child's world intact in the middle of external noise. The responsibility that redefined success entirely. Over time, Simon began to realize that responsibility as a father carried a very different weight than responsibility in business or entertainment. In his professional life, success was measurable. It had outcomes, results, and recognition. But in fatherhood, responsibility was continuous and often invisible. It did not end with decisions or achievements. It extended into every routine, every environment, and every reaction to the world around his son. This created a form of accountability that was ongoing rather than situational. Success, in this context, was no longer about expansion or recognition. It became about stability, about ensuring that Eric felt understood, supported, and safe in his environment. These goals did not produce headlines or awards, but they shaped daily life in meaningful ways. Simon began to measure success differently, a calm transition between activities, a moment of comfort in an unfamiliar setting, or a shared interaction that felt natural. These became the markers of progress. This shift fundamentally changed how he viewed his own achievements. What once defined him professionally no longer carried the same emotional weight. A new framework had emerged, one that valued presence over performance. The quiet work, happening away from everything visible. Much of what defined Simon's journey during this period never reached public awareness. There were no announcements, no structured updates, and no external validation. Instead, there was a steady process of adaptation taking place within private spaces. Daily life involved continuous learning. Understanding sensory needs, communication differences, and behavioral patterns required patience and observation. These were not quick adjustments. They were ongoing refinements shaped by experience. Therapies, routines, and structured environments became part of a consistent framework. But beyond these formal systems, there was an even more important layer: emotional understanding. Learning how Eric experienced the world required attention that could not be rushed. Simon found himself developing a different kind of awareness. It was not analytical in the way his professional judgment had been. It was relational, built through repetition, familiarity, and time. This quiet work did not produce dramatic transformation. Instead, it built stability gradually. It created an environment where growth could occur naturally, without pressure or expectation. What emerged from this process was not a redefined public image, but a reshaped private reality, one built on patience rather than performance, letting go of imagined futures without losing connection. One of the most emotionally complex aspects of Simon's experience as a father was the gradual release of imagined expectations. These expectations were not rigid plans, but natural assumptions about how life might unfold between parent and child. Over time, those expectations had to be reconsidered. Certain experiences that are often assumed in parenting did not present themselves in the way he had once envisioned. This required emotional adjustment, not rejection. What made this process difficult was not the absence of experiences, but the reshaping of meaning. It was learning to find value in different forms of connection, forms that did not rely on traditional milestones. Instead of shared conversations, there were shared understandings. Instead of predictable narratives, there were adaptive interactions. Connection still existed, but it expressed itself differently. This shift did not weaken the relationship. In many ways, it deepened it. It removed assumptions and replaced them with attentiveness. It required paying closer attention to small signals, subtle responses, and quiet forms of communication. Letting go of expectation did not mean letting go of hope. It meant redefining what hope looked like in practice, the life that continued evolving without public recognition. While public attention occasionally focused on aspects of Simon Cowell's life, the most significant developments remained largely unseen. The transformation occurring within his role as a father was not something that could be captured in brief moments or media snapshots. Life continued to evolve in ways that were gradual and continuous. There were no final stages or fixed outcomes. Instead, there was ongoing adaptation shaped by experience and time. This evolution affected not only routines but perspective. The way Simon understood people, communication, and development changed significantly. He began to see complexity where he might once have seen simplicity. Importantly, this change did not remove his identity as a public figure. It existed alongside it. Two parallel realities developed, one visible, one private. What made this coexistence possible was structure. Boundaries between public and private life became more defined, allowing each to function without overwhelming the other. In that separation, space was created for something more stable to grow within his personal world, something grounded in consistency rather than visibility. What remains when everything else is stripped back? At its core, Simon Cowell's journey as a father is not defined by public narrative, diagnosis, or professional identity. It is defined by the quiet restructuring of priorities that happens when life demands something deeper than control or achievement. What remains after everything is stripped back is presence. Not performance, not perception, but consistent presence in the life of another person who experiences the world differently. This presence does not rely on explanation or recognition. It exists through routine, attention, and care. It is built in ordinary moments that carry extraordinary significance within their own context. Over time, this presence becomes the foundation of connection. It replaces expectation with understanding and replaces assumption with awareness. In that space, the meaning of fatherhood is no longer defined externally. It is defined through lived experience, through continuity, patience, and adaptation. And in that reality, what once felt like an emotional ending becomes something else entirely, a continuing journey shaped not by what was lost, but by what was learned. A life built on fame and pressure. Simon Cowell's rise in the entertainment industry was not gradual, it was explosive. From the early days behind the scenes in music production to becoming one of the most recognizable television judges in the world, his career was defined by precision, confidence, and a brutally honest approach that audiences either loved or hated. Shows like Pop Idol, American Idol, The X Factor, and Britain's Got Talent turned him into a global figure whose opinions could shape careers overnight. But behind the sharp suits and sharper criticism was a life built entirely around work. His production company, Psycho Entertainment, became a powerhouse, discovering and managing some of the biggest music acts in modern pop history. Every day was scheduled around meetings, auditions, recordings, and international travel. Fame wasn't just part of his life, it was the structure of it. Yet even at the height of success, something was quietly shifting. The constant cycle of work began to feel less fulfilling over time. The applause, the ratings, and the global recognition no longer carried the same weight they once did. Life was full, but it wasn't necessarily grounded. That foundation would soon be challenged in a way Simon never expected, not by career changes, but by something far more personal and permanent, a turning point hidden in personal change. The year 2013 marked a major shift in Simon Cowell's private life, even though at the time it seemed like just another celebrity headline. His relationship with Lauren Silverman became public under complicated circumstances, drawing intense media attention and public speculation. The situation escalated when legal proceedings involving Lauren's previous marriage brought Simon into the spotlight in a way he had never experienced before outside television. Despite the controversy, what followed was not scandal alone but transformation. The legal matters were eventually settled privately, and soon after, news emerged that Simon was going to become a father. This revelation marked the beginning of a chapter that would completely redefine his priorities. For someone who had spent decades avoiding long-term domestic responsibility, fatherhood was not something he had planned for. His identity had always been rooted in independence, control, and professional ambition. Yet life had introduced something irreversible. The arrival of his son Eric in 2014 didn't just change his schedule, it reshaped his emotional landscape entirely. What once felt like a life built around constant motion began to slow down internally. Even though his public persona remained unchanged, privately he was stepping into unfamiliar emotional territory, one that required patience, vulnerability, and a different kind of strength. The arrival of Eric and a new emotional reality. When Eric Cowell was born on February 14, 2014, it was more than a personal milestone. It was a psychological turning point. Simon Cowell, a man known for controlling environments and outcomes in his professional world, suddenly found himself in a situation where control meant something entirely different. In interviews and reflections, he later admitted that fatherhood was not something he had prepared for emotionally, but the moment he saw his son, something shifted in a way that could not be reversed. The routines of television production and global business suddenly felt secondary to something far more immediate and intimate. Eric became the center of a world that had previously revolved around entertainment schedules and industry demands. Simple moments began to carry weight. Feeding, sleeping, and early development milestones became more significant than ratings or show formats. Simon began adjusting his time in ways he never had before, prioritizing presence over productivity. Even though he continued working, the structure of his life subtly changed. Long absences became shorter. Decisions about projects were filtered through a new question: how would this affect time with his son? Without announcing any dramatic shift, his priorities were already reorganizing themselves around fatherhood. Early signs, questions, and unspoken concerns. As Eric grew into his early toddler years, Simon began noticing subtle differences that he couldn't easily ignore. At first, these observations were not framed as concern, but as curiosity. Every child develops differently, and he was aware of that. Still, certain patterns stood out in ways that lingered in his thoughts. One of the earliest observations was communication. While other children around Eric's age began forming simple words and expressive reactions, Eric's communication style seemed different. It wasn't absence of awareness, far from it, but rather a different mode of interaction with the world. Situations involving noise, crowds, or overstimulation also appeared to affect him more intensely. These reactions were not consistent, but they were noticeable enough for Simon to begin paying closer attention. As someone whose entire career had been built on reading people and recognizing patterns, he found it difficult to dismiss what he was seeing. Despite reassurance from those around him that children develop at different speeds, Simon's mind continued to return to these small details, not out of fear, but out of responsibility. He began observing more carefully, not looking for problems, but for understanding. At night, these thoughts often resurfaced. Instead of distraction or dismissal, he leaned into learning, reading, researching, and trying to understand developmental differences in children. It was the beginning of a deeper awareness that would eventually lead him toward answers he was not yet ready to confront. A family trip that changed everything. What began as a simple family holiday gradually turned into one of the most revealing moments in Simon Cowell's life as a father. The intention behind the trip was straightforward: time away from work, space to relax, and an opportunity to share normal experiences with his young son Eric. From the outside, it looked like a typical break, but for Simon, it became something far more significant. Eric's reactions to the unfamiliar environment stood out in ways that could not be easily dismissed. New places, unpredictable routines, and sensory overload from noise and crowds created visible distress. What others might have seen as ordinary childhood discomfort began to feel different in pattern and intensity. Simon didn't interpret it immediately as a problem, but as information, something worth observing closely rather than rushing to conclusions. Throughout the trip, small moments accumulated into a larger picture. Changes in routine appeared to unsettle Eric more than expected. Social settings that were meant to be enjoyable instead created withdrawal and discomfort. Even mealtimes and simple activities became difficult to navigate smoothly. For Simon, who had spent a lifetime noticing details others overlooked, these patterns were hard to ignore. The turning point wasn't a single event, but a collection of repeated responses that suggested Eric experienced the world in a fundamentally different way. The trip ended, but the questions it raised stayed with Simon long after they returned home, quietly shaping how he began to view his son's development, seeking understanding instead of assumptions. After the trip, Simon Cowell did not rush toward conclusions. Instead, he entered a phase of quiet observation and reflection. He began to see parenting less as instinct alone and more as something that sometimes requires outside knowledge and guidance. Rather than relying on assumptions, he started asking deeper questions about development, communication, and sensory perception in children. He spoke with people close to him, but also began reading extensively on his own. Books, articles, and expert discussions became part of his routine. What stood out to him was not just what matched Eric's behavior, but how many variations of development existed in children that were often misunderstood or overlooked. Still, uncertainty lingered. There were no simple answers, and that lack of clarity was difficult in itself. Simon was used to making decisions quickly in his professional life, but this situation required patience. Instead of control, it required understanding over time. During this period, his attention toward Eric became more intentional. He noticed not just challenges, but also strengths, focus, detail awareness, and unique patterns of engagement with the world. It became less about labeling differences and more about understanding them. That shift in perspective marked an important emotional transition in how he approached fatherhood. The diagnosis that brought clarity. The formal diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder came after a series of professional evaluations and consultations. By the time Simon Cowell heard the conclusion, he was no longer entirely unprepared, but the moment still carried emotional weight. It transformed uncertainty into definition, and questions into a clearer framework of understanding. The diagnosis did not change Eric. It changed how Simon interpreted what he had already been observing. Behaviors that once felt confusing now had context. Sensory sensitivities, communication differences, and the need for routine were no longer isolated concerns but part of a broader developmental profile. Importantly, the diagnosis also highlighted strengths that might have otherwise gone unnoticed. Focus, pattern recognition, and deep engagement with specific interests were all part of Eric's cognitive profile. For Simon, this duality was important. It reframed the situation not as limitation, but as difference with both challenges and abilities. Emotionally, the experience was complex. There was no single reaction. Instead, there was processing, adjustment, and reflection. What mattered most was not the label itself, but what it meant for the future. How to support Eric in a way that respected who he was, rather than trying to force him into expectations that did not fit. Rebuilding life around a different reality. After the diagnosis, Simon Cowell's lifestyle began to change in practical and immediate ways. The structure of his daily life was no longer centered on work schedules and industry demands, but around consistency, stability, and predictability for Eric. His home environment was adjusted to reduce sensory overload. Lighting, sound levels, and spatial layout were modified to create a calmer atmosphere. This was not about luxury or design, it was about accessibility and comfort. Every change served a purpose, to help Eric feel safe and grounded. Simon's professional decisions also began to shift. Projects were evaluated not only for career value, but for how they would impact time and presence at home. Travel became more selective. Long absences were reduced. The pace of his life, once fast and global, became more anchored. Daily routines gained importance. Consistency became a priority, and unpredictability was minimized where possible. Even social interactions were planned with care, ensuring Eric was not placed in overwhelming situations. Parenting became a process of anticipation and adaptation rather than reaction. This stage of life marked a clear transformation. Simon was no longer just balancing career and family. He was actively restructuring his world around the needs of his son, creating a foundation built on stability rather than spontaneity. Living between privacy and public attention. As Eric grew older, public curiosity began to increase, even though Simon Cowell made a conscious effort to keep his son's life private. Being a public figure meant that even carefully protected boundaries were sometimes difficult to maintain completely. Occasional appearances sparked attention, and small moments were often interpreted and discussed widely. What Simon saw as private family life sometimes became public conversation, creating a tension between visibility and protection. This dynamic placed him in a difficult position. On one hand, there was a desire to correct misconceptions and reduce speculation. On the other, there was a strong need to preserve Eric's privacy and allow him to grow without external pressure or judgment. Simon chose restraint. Instead of engaging heavily with public narratives, he focused on limiting exposure and controlling what entered the public space. When he did speak, it was often with careful intent, less about explanation, more about setting boundaries. Over time, this approach reflected a deeper understanding. Not everything needed to be shared to be respected. Privacy became not just a preference, but a form of protection, and that protection became part of his identity as a father. The emotional weight of a changed fatherhood. As time passed, Simon Cowell found himself living a version of fatherhood that did not match anything he had imagined earlier in life. It wasn't defined by dramatic moments or public declarations, but by quiet adjustments that accumulated day after day. The emotional weight of that shift wasn't always visible from the outside, but it was constant in his private world. He had once pictured fatherhood in simpler terms: shared activities, spontaneous conversations, and an easy rhythm of understanding between parent and child. What he discovered instead was a deeper, more complex connection built through observation, patience, and adaptation. That difference required him to rethink what being present actually meant. There were moments of loss within that adjustment, not loss of love, but loss of expectation. The future he had unconsciously imagined had to be released and replaced with something less predictable, but more real. In its place came a relationship shaped by awareness rather than assumption. At times, this emotional shift was difficult to articulate, even for himself. It wasn't sadness in the traditional sense, but a quiet recognition that life had moved in a direction that demanded a different kind of strength. And within that shift, he began to understand fatherhood not as a fixed role, but as something constantly evolving with the child at its center. Learning through therapy and daily structure. Once the diagnosis provided clarity, daily life began to revolve around structured support systems designed to help Eric develop skills at his own pace. Therapy sessions became a consistent part of life, introducing routines that focused on communication, sensory regulation, and adaptive learning. These sessions were not about quick progress, but gradual understanding. Each small step mattered, whether it was a new response, improved comfort in certain environments, or increased engagement in simple tasks. Progress was measured in subtle changes rather than dramatic milestones. Simon's role during this time extended beyond observation. He became actively involved in understanding methods used by professionals so he could reinforce them at home. This required patience and consistency, as repetition and stability were essential for Eric's sense of security. The home environment itself became an extension of this structured approach. Predictability was prioritized in daily routines, reducing unnecessary stress and helping Eric navigate his surroundings with greater ease. What emerged was a system built not on perfection, but on consistency and care. Over time, this process reshaped Simon's understanding of learning itself. It was no longer something measured by speed or comparison, but by individual growth and comfort. Every small improvement carried meaning, and every stable routine became part of a larger foundation of support. The pressure of public perception. As awareness of Eric increased in the public sphere, Simon Cowell faced a new challenge that extended beyond parenting itself: managing external perception. Being a well-known public figure meant that even private family matters occasionally became subject to speculation and commentary. This attention created a difficult balance. On one hand, there was a desire to protect Eric from unnecessary exposure. On the other, there was an unavoidable public curiosity that came with Simon's level of fame. Navigating this space required careful boundaries and deliberate communication choices. Misinterpretations sometimes surfaced in media narratives, often based on limited understanding or incomplete information. Rather than engaging in constant correction, Simon chose a more restrained approach, focusing on reducing exposure rather than expanding explanation. The impact of this pressure was not always visible, but it influenced decisions about appearances, interviews, and public events. Each choice carried consideration for how it might affect Eric's privacy and well-being. In this environment, silence often became a form of protection. By limiting discussion, Simon aimed to create a buffer between his son's private world and external speculation, even when curiosity from the public continued to grow. A personal transformation beyond fame. Over time, the changes in Simon Cowell's life extended beyond parenting and into his broader identity. The man once known primarily for his sharp critiques and commanding presence in entertainment began to reflect qualities that were less visible in his earlier public persona. This transformation was not sudden or performative. It developed gradually through lived experience, shaped by responsibility, routine, and emotional connection. Priorities shifted in ways that affected how he approached work, time, and personal fulfillment. Success, once measured through industry influence and global reach, began to take on a different meaning. Presence, stability, and emotional awareness gained importance alongside professional achievement. The definition of accomplishment expanded beyond career milestones. At the same time, he did not abandon his professional life entirely. Instead, he rebalanced it, ensuring that it aligned more closely with his responsibilities at home. This balance required constant adjustment, as both roles demanded attention in different ways. What emerged from this process was not a different person, but a more layered one, someone whose experiences as a father reshaped how he understood control, empathy, and long-term purpose. A quiet conclusion, built on acceptance and growth. In the end, Simon Cowell's journey as a father became less about dramatic change and more about continuous adaptation. There was no single moment that defined everything, but rather a long series of decisions, reflections, and adjustments that shaped a new way of living. Acceptance became a central part of that journey, not in the sense of resignation, but in the sense of understanding. Eric was not viewed through the lens of expectation, but through recognition of who he was as an individual, with his own strengths and needs. Through this process, Simon learned that love does not always follow predictable patterns. It often requires patience, learning, and the willingness to let go of assumptions. Fatherhood, in this sense, became less about guiding a predetermined path and more about walking alongside someone on a path that is uniquely their own. What remained constant was commitment. Regardless of challenges, public attention, or personal adjustment, the focus stayed on creating an environment where Eric could grow with stability and support. And in that ongoing journey, Simon Cowell's story quietly shifted from a life defined by performance and judgment to one shaped by understanding, presence, and a deeply personal form of resilience.